to another episode of Opal Wave MTG. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be checking out Estrid the Masked. So Estrid is a Bant planeswalker that can be your commander, and she reads +2, untap each enchanted permanent you control, -1, create a white aura enchantment token named Mask attached to another target permanent. The token has enchant permanent and totem armor, and totem armor is it's an ability that says if the permanent that it is enchanted were to be destroyed, instead you destroy the enchantment with totem armor. So just a form of protection there. -7, put the top 7 cards of your library into your graveyard, return all non-aura enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, then do the same for aura cards. And generally this type of deck you can go a few different directions with it. Most of the time she's really good at generating overwhelming value, because once you get a few enchantments on your lands or creatures, you start drawing cards with your enchantress effects, and you're generating extra value with your Estrid. So generating just overwhelming value here, and that's actually how we're going to be going about with the Skirmish version of Estrid here. So we've got Calyx as a just a fun planeswalker to throw in here, kind of like a second Estrid in a way. The ult is more or less the same. -7, return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. +1 is kind of a way for us to just find extra enchantments, and then the -3 can serve as removal if we really need to. There's some slight synergy in the deck that we can use with this. Just a fun card to include in an enchantress deck. We'll move on to the creatures here, and there's actually a lot of really good options for enchantress effects that are pretty cheap. We got Shoal Kraken. It's more of a looting effect, draw and then discard. Satyr Enchanter, Mace Enchantress, Sithis, Citizen Champion, Eidolon of Blossoms, all really great. You can also use the Protean Thaumaturge. Whenever enchantment enters, you can have it become a copy of another target creature. So you can have it copy one of your enchantress effects, and then you basically use it as another enchantress. We've got a couple of ways to go wide with Ajani's Chosen and Archon of Sun's Grace. And Herod's Pilgrim is a great way to tutor for some of the auras in our deck, especially since we want to be enchanting our lands and sometimes creatures. Just a great tutor overall. Flux Channeler has really great synergy, since you can proliferate the counters on Estrid or Calyx if you really want to. Some fun synergies with the Citizen Champion as well. Caliph is pretty much here just as a way to just a little bit of extra protection. Spells your opponents cast that target this permanent cost 1 more, and that applies for creatures and enchantments that you control. Herald of the Pantheon can reduce our enchantments by 1 less, since we're going to be kind of generating that overwhelming value, casting multiple enchantments in 1 turn. Herald definitely starts generating a lot of value when you're casting multiple spells in 1 turn. Faith Healer is a sacrifice an enchantment, gain life equal to the sacrifice enchantment's total casting cost. A lot of fun shenanigans that you can do with this card. Another really strong perk is, since enchantment decks are primarily board state centric, you want to create that very large board state. You can be kind of soft to mass exile effects. I'm talking about Ugin or like a Merciless Eviction. So having a sacrifice outlet for your enchantments is really nice. So they're not exiled forever. They can at least go to your graveyard, and then you can bring them back with Estrid or Calyx. So Faith Healer is a great card in enchantment decks. Then we've got Nihilus Colossus with, so basically Nihilus Colossus, when it or another enchantment enters battlefield under your control, double target creature's power and toughness until the end of turn. So get a couple enchantments down, and like your Citizen Champion can just be absolutely huge, or you can just target a token, or even one of these guys if you really want to. So just a cool way to finish with this creature here. Moving on to our sorceries, we got a couple of board wipes here. Wrath of God, Austere Command has great flexibility. You can choose to destroy all artifacts, or you can, if you really need to, you can hit all enchantments and maybe cast like a Heroic Intervention in response. of course, holding priority and protect your own enchantments, or just recur them with like Dance of the Manse. Speaking of Dance of the Manse, just another way for us to recur all of our enchantments from our graveyard. And Martial Coup, actually, I really like this card. Uh, Most of the time, you're going to be able to cast X for 5, and you'll be able to just create those blockers that you need post board wipe, which can be super useful, especially when you're trying to protect Estrid here. Idyllic Tutor, just a pretty great tutor since they reprinted it in Theros Beyond Death. It's no longer like a $30 card, so $7, not too bad for a tutor. Moving on to our instance, just a couple of removal spells, a couple of counter spells, a little bit of protection going on here with Heroic Intervention. What I really want to point out is Second Sunrise and Faith's Reward. These cards are a lot of fun to play with, especially when you get with once you get a Faith Healer out, because basically you sacrifice all your enchantments and then you can cast the Second Sunrise and get them all back and do some really crazy stuff. Or even if like an opponent casts a like a destroy all enchantments kind of thing, maybe your opponent casts an Austere Command or a Bane of Progress, Second Sunrise is basically you just get all your enchantments back, and you also trigger constellations. So like your Citizen Champion, Nihilus Colossus, Eidolon of Blossom, Shoalcrack, and all these things are going to trigger again. So this can turn a really bad situation into a very favorable position for you. Second Sunrise does count everybody, so no matter what. So if like your opponents lose some enchantments, they'll get those back too. So you need to keep that into account when you're casting this spell. Faith's Reward costs 1 mana more, but it only counts for you. So just a little bit of redundancy there, just to make sure that we can have it and have that fun interaction. Only one artifact in the deck, Soul Ring. We really want to have as many enchantments as we can, and a lot of our enchantments are going to be our mana ramp, so we don't really need to worry about that. Moving on to our enchantments, so like I was saying before, we've got a lot of ramp in our enchantments because it synergizes so well with Estrid, Fertile Ground, Find the Path, Gift of Paradise, Karametra's Favor, just ways for us to enchant our permanents and get more of those untap effects. Removal is also going to be in our enchantment section. If you noticed, our instants are kind of on the low side, but we are supplementing that with our enchantment removal. So stuff like Seal of Cleansing, Seal of Primordium are fantastic. Ways to fend off our opponents like Sphere of Safety, Sandward Convergence can both protect us and be a win con in one, so it's really strong. Shark Typhoon is a really interesting way to just create beaters. So whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is the spell's converted mana cost. So kind of like a Sigil of the Empty Throne, more or less. The power and toughness are going to vary, obviously, with what spells you're casting. But just another way for us to generate creatures that we can swing with. Then Pursuit of Knowledge is really cool. I love this card so much, and it gets even better once you start incorporating things like Second Sunrise and Fate's Reward. So you skip a couple of your draws and you hit the 3 counters. So you remove the 3 study counters and then you sacrifice Pursuit of Knowledge to draw 7 cards. So what you do is you sacrifice your Pursuit of Knowledge and you hold priority. You hold priority and you cast Second Sunrise or the Fate's Reward, and that will bring back Pursuit of Knowledge, and then the ability of Pursuit of Knowledge resolves and you draw 7 cards. So you can skip the next 3 draws, you draw 4 cards, and then you can sacrifice Pursuit of Knowledge again and draw another 7 cards. So you essentially draw like 11 cards off of that interaction. Can also do the same thing with the 2 seals that we have here, or even like with a Faith Healer. You can like cast your Oblivion Ring and then in response sack it. So just a lot of really fun shenanigans that we can do here. Estrid's Invocation is really nice way to just copy whatever enchantment we need. Plenty of enchantments that either generate us card advantage or just are our win conditions. So moving on to our lands. Pretty cheap here in the lands. Considering our ramp package, it's kind of heavier on the green side here. Want to make sure that we get the green mana early. Most of our deck is green anyway, green-white primarily with a splash of blue. So our land base is going to represent that curve, looking pretty good here. And yeah, so that's going to be our skirmish version. Moving on to the battle version of Estrid, we've actually dropped Calyx as we kind of make the deck a little bit more efficient in what it wants to do. And this version is actually going to feature a combo that this channel is actually named after, Opal Wave. And so we can actually just skip to that real quick. So Opal Wave is it's a very classic combo that involves Parallax Wave and either Opalescence or Starfield of Nyx. And we're using Starfield of Nyx in this situation for price reasons. If you want to, you spend a little bit more money, you could get the Parallax Wave, or excuse me, you can get the Opalescence. In addition to the Starfield, so Starfield turns all of your non-aura enchantments into creatures, in addition to their other types. Parallax Wave reads, Fading 5, remove a fade counter from Parallax Wave, remove target creature from the game. When Parallax Wave leaves play, each player returns to play all cards he or she owns removed from the game with Parallax Wave. So, because Starfield turns them all into creatures, we can remove counters from Parallax Wave to exile our own enchantments, including itself, and when you remove Parallax Wave targeting itself, its ability will trigger. So its leave the battlefield play will trigger. So it'll exile itself, and then its ability will return itself, including the other enchantments, to the battlefield. Depending on how you stack it, you can permanently exile your opponent's creatures, or your creatures if you really want to for some odd reason. So how that works is, first you remove a fading counter from Parallax Wave to target a permanent that you want to exile. Then in response to that, holding priority, you remove a counter from Parallax Wave to exile itself. So Parallax Wave will exile itself, and then its ability will resolve, and it will bring back Parallax Wave. And then the initial removing of the fade counter to exile the permanent that you originally targeted will resolve and go to exile. And because when Parallax Wave leaves the battlefield trigger is already resolved, the card just stays in exile and forever. So you can exile all of your opponent's creatures if you really want to. There's a few outlets that you can use for this, and the one that I chose is Induced Amnesia. So Induced Amnesia says, when Induced Amnesia enters the battlefield, target player exiles all cards from his or her hand face down, and then draws that many cards. When Induced Amnesia is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hand. So a couple of key things here. The Induced Amnesia can be used outside of the combo to just draw yourself more cards if you really need to. So some nice flexibility as a win condition and card advantage. And then the second part is, it says specifically when it is put into the graveyard. So when you are performing the Parallax Wave combo with Starfield, so Induced Amnesia is going to target into the battlefield, and you're going to target your opponent. As long as they have one card in their hand, this combo works, and you will effectively exile your opponent's library. So Induced Amnesia enters the battlefield, and you would target your opponent. Before the ability resolves, you exile Induced Amnesia, and then you exile Parallax Wave, which will bring both back to the battlefield. And then Induced Amnesia will trigger again, and you target your opponent again. And so you stack all of those triggers on top of each other, and then you let all of those triggers resolve on the stack. This way, your opponents don't have time to respond in between each time of you activating or triggering the Induced Amnesia. So instead of letting each one resolve, you instead just force them to, they'll each resolve individually, but even if your opponent removes or finds removal for the Induced Amnesia, it's going to be too late because all the triggers are already on the stack outside of a summary dismissal or some way to stifle the ability. But you, again, would have to stifle all of those abilities on the stack. So it'd get kind of interesting. So effectively exiling your opponent's entire library and forcing them to draw out, assuming they have at least one card in their hand. So one of my favorite combos, and the combo that I named my channel after. So a few other things we can do with that combo, like some constellation triggers, like we can make infinite tokens, or we can draw cards as much as we need to with Eidolon of Blossoms. And we'll get to how we get to that combo as we move through the deck. So as you can see here, our creatures are tightened up a little bit. We've got a few mana dorks. Arbor Elf is really great, just as another way to untap our lands, or forests more specifically once they're suited up. We've got Voyaging Satyr as well, and Curious Follower. Both can untap lands, and once you get an enchantment on them as well, they just start doing some crazy stuff, especially with Estrid, excuse me. Destiny Spinner is a way to stop our opponents from countering our spells. And then we've got Collect Roof as a way to stop the artifacts, because we're primarily going to be playing enchantments again. You probably saw earlier, we're still just on Sol Ring, because well, most of our ramp is going to be tied into our enchantments and our creatures. So we break parity on this card really easily. And it also stops our opponents, their Docksides. Since we are playing an enchantment heavy deck, we feed Dockside really hard. So having a way to kind of slow down Dockside here is really important. And then our enchantresses, we've kind of cleaned those up just a little bit. We've added the Argothian Enchantress. It is a rather expensive Enchantress, which is why I did not include it in the Skirmish version. And then Spark Double is actually it's basically another Estrid. You can have it enter as a copy of Estrid, and that's its primary purpose. In a pinch, you could copy a creature or an Enchantress if you really wanted to, but the main purpose is to get a second Estrid. Moving on to our sorceries, we're still on the Estrid Command. It's a fantastic board wipe. Dance in the Manse, another way to recur our stuff. We've got Eldritch Evolution. It's on the cheaper side as far as tutors go, and it's just a really strong tutor in general. A couple of land ramp spells, Kodama's Reach, Cultivate. Wargate can tutor for any permanent, straight to the battlefield, so pretty nice in Bant colors actually. Idyllic Tutor, just again, great tutor. And Open the Armory. So funny enough, you can search the library for an aura or an equipment, and we have a ton of auras in our deck. So Open the Armory can search for tons of stuff, even though we're not really going to be using it for the equipment part. Tutoring for an aura is really strong, especially at 2 mana. Moving on to our instants. Again, our instant package is more of, it's supplementary to our removal suite in the enchantments. Just to kind of, sometimes it's better to actually counter things before they resolve, as opposed to dealing with things after they resolve, because once, like, if it's got like an ETB or something like that, much better to just not let it resolve. Aether Spouts, in case we got swung out by a bunch of people, or creatures rather, and Court of Calling, another really great tutor. Remove enchantments is actually really interesting. So much like how the Faith Healer allowed us to kind of dodge those mass exile effects, Remove enchantments basically does the same thing. So there's a lot of really weird text on this card, but TLDR, return all enchantments you control to your owner to your hand. Moving on to our enchantments, got the removal, a little bit of stacks, Blind Obedience, Ashes of the Abhorrent. Again, we've got the seals. These seals are absolutely fantastic. Sunken Field has some really nice utility, especially with Estrid. We'll pretty much have this open all the time and just kind of force spike our opponent. Basically just make them have the extra mana all the time, which can be taxing in certain situations. As you can see, our graveyard hate is it still leaves the cards in the graveyard, and that's really important, mainly because with Estrid we want to we want to get stuff from our graveyard too. So running something like a Rest in Peace would be a little awkward in this deck if it were. We've got Blind Obedience. as a way, again, to slow down the Dockside Extortionist. If you really wanted to, you could also add the Stony Silence just as an extra way to stop those artifacts from coming in. And then our ramp is a little more streamlined as well. Not as many of the 3 mana ramp, but we've got stuff like Fertile Ground. Overgrowth is nice. Generally, the 3 mana auras, they only generate 1 extra mana. Overgrowth is one of the few that actually produces an additional 2 mana, so definitely worth it in this slot. Then we've got Utopian Sprawl, Wild Growth, and Wolf Willow Haven. These are probably the better ones that you can be using, and then Wolf Willow Haven is pretty much on par with like Fertile Ground as a like 2 mana ramp 1 kind of spell. So Oath of Teferi is going to be one of our combo pieces, and it gets a little convoluted, but what we're going to do is we're going to enchant a Forge of Heroes or a Karn's Bastion, and we'll cast our Estrid, and then we will activate our Forge of Heroes to put a loyalty counter on Estrid. Then we'll plus Estrid and untap our Forge of Heroes, and then we can activate our Forge of Heroes again to put another +1/+1 counter on her. So she starts at 3. We put 1 on with Forge of Heroes, it makes 4, plus her up 2, puts her up to 6, and then we activate Forge of Heroes again, puts her up to 7. If we have other lands that are enchanted and we can produce a lot of mana, this allows us to ult Estrid and then recast Estrid depending on how many permanents you have enchanted. And of course, as you continue to activate Estrid, you're going to reanimate your auras. So as you do it, the amount of mana that you're gaining will increase. And so as we continue to do that, eventually we will reanimate the Starfield Parallax Wave plus Induced Amnesia, and from there win the game. We can also do the same thing with Ashiok's Erasure. So Ashiok's Erasure is a really cool card. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell, and your opponents can't cast spells with the same name as the exile card. And when Ashiok's Erasure leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to its owner's hand. So essentially, with the Parallax Wave combo, or the Opal Wave combo rather, we can infinitely counter our opponent's spells. And another way we can use Estrid over and over and over again is with Freed from the Real. So Freed from the Real says pay 1 blue, tap enchanted creature, or pay 1 blue to untap enchanted creature. So from here, we enchant either Voyaging Satyr, Kiro's Follower, or in some cases we can do Arbor Elf depending on what land we have enchanted. So we enchant one of these guys, and then we create infinite mana with one of our lands. And from there, we are going to infinitely untap and retap our Forge of Heroes. So Forge of Heroes, it has to target a commander that entered the battlefield this turn. So we'll cast our Estrid. We will use the Forge of Heroes or Karn's Bastion to immediately proliferate her up to 7. And then even if you don't really need the Oath of Teferi as a second activation, because you don't even need to activate Estrid until you ult her. So basically, cast Estrid, plus her up to ult immediately, recast Estrid, plus her up to 7, and then ult again, and you just rinse and repeat until you find your combo again. So moving on to our lands, of course the 2 key lands in the deck are going to be Forge of Heroes and the Karn's Bastion. Really strong lands in terms of getting Estrid to ult multiple times in one turn. Lotus Field has can generate a ton of mana with Estrid once it's enchanted. It also has Hexproof, so it innately protects itself from things like Strip Mine and whatnot, so you can suit this land up and just kind of go ham and not have to worry too much about your opponents interacting with it. Nykthos, a really strong way to ramp, especially since we're playing an enchantment deck. We want to create a really strong board presence and overwhelming value, and Nykthos definitely plays into that really well. And that's going to be our battle version. Alright, and that brings us to the glory version of Estrid. And before I go over this one, if you like the content that I'm doing, please leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what commander you'd like to see me do next. We've got Jace as a Planeswalker in the deck. and this is more or less just a win con. That and Thassa's Oracle, and we'll get into how we win with that once we move to our enchantment section. So as you can see, our creatures look a lot different now. We've added in the rest of the Mana Dork suite. It's really important in cEDH that we ramp as quickly as possible. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be using our dorks to ramp really quickly, in addition to our enchantments. And then we've also slimmed down the amount of enchantress effects in our deck to really just the more or less most important ones, or the most efficient ones. So our Grothian Enchantress, Sithis are both at 2 mana and really fantastic. Eidolon, you can keep it, you can not keep it. I don't think it makes too big of a difference. I really like it because even though it's 4 mana, it will immediately draw you that card. And then we've got Citizen Champion at 3 mana, can also do a really good job at blocking and or attacking. This guy gets really big before people really realize it. Plus it's a 1/3, so the turn it comes down, it can immediately block some really important things like Tymna, or the creatures that Tymna decks generally use to swing at people. Grand Abolisher is here to help us protect our combo. We still got the Heliod's Pilgrim. Unfortunately, there aren't like a ton of options for tutoring enchantments in white, so we're just going to take what we can get at this point. And then, moving on to our sorceries, Eldritch Evolution, Finale of Devastation can be a way for us to win the game. Fabricate, you might be scratching your head a little bit at this include. Once we get to the artifacts, it'll make a little bit more sense. Open the Armory again as a way to tutor for an aura. And Vanquish the Horde, just a super efficient removal spell. Each opponent only needs to have 2 creatures out in order for this to cost 2 white mana, and that's not including your own creatures too. And this deck can easily, survive after a board wipe like that. Moving on to our instants, we've kind of beefed up our instant package a little bit here, as far as removal goes. cEDH is going to play more on the stack, so we want to be able to interact in that way efficiently. So Delay is fantastic, catch-all kind of counter spell. Generally the game won't last long enough for them to actually see the spell resolve. So you counter the spell and you exile it with 3 time counters on it instead of putting it to its owner's graveyard, and then it gains suspend. So they have to wait 3 whole turn cycles before they're going to be able to cast that spell. And like I said, most likely the game will be over at that point. Dovin's Veto, classic, can't be countered, counter target non-creature spell, really hard to interact with there, outside of like maybe a deflecting swat. Furious Guardianship, Force of Will, free counter spells, Swan Song, super efficient. Veil of Summer, another way for us to protect our combo. Noxious Revival has some really unique utility, not only in getting back our own stuff, but interacting with our opponent's graveyard shenanigans. Then we've got Word of Invention as another way to tutor for artifacts. And actually, speaking of artifacts, we'll go ahead and move to our artifact section. So here we've upped up our artifact package just a hair. Static Orb and Winter Orb are fantastic for slowing our opponents down, and Estrid breaks parity with these cards. So just great ways to slow our opponents down. We've got Chrome Mox, Mana Crypt, and Soaring. These are some of the better artifact ramp spells in the format, so we're going to throw them in there. Just super explosive starts that these allowed us to do. And then we've got the Chain Veil. So Estrid has can kind of act like a Teferi and do Chain Veil shenanigans once you enchant the Chain Veil, and that can effectively give you infinite Estrid activations. So we've thrown it in here as a way for us to like I said, do infinite Estrid activations, and eventually mill ourselves out and get our Parallax Wave combo out. Moving on to our enchantments, a little bit more stacksy here. Again, we got the Blind Obedience, slows down the dockside, and there's a ton of artifact ramp in this format, so just fantastic overall. Aura of Silence doesn't seem that crazy until it resolves, and then your opponents have to pay 2 more for their artifacts and enchantments. So like Soul Rings now cost 3 mana, Your Chrome Moxes and your Mox Opals and all that stuff cost 2 mana, so resolving an ad nauseam and then winning with this card on the field is really hard to do. Especially for like the mono black red decks that really rely on that fast mana and rituals to win once they resolve their ad nauseams. We've got a couple of ways to enchant our creatures. Instill Energy and Nature's Chosen both allow us to untap the creature sans Estrid, but even if we do have Estrid, it kind of gets even crazier. And these actually are another combo with Words of Wind. So Words of Wind is pay 1, the next time you draw a card this turn, each player returns a permanent he or she controls to its owner's hand instead. So what we're going to do is with an Enchantress effect out, we'll cast our Nature's Chosen or Instill Energy, and then with the draw trigger on the stack, whether it's a Constellation effect or whether it's when we cast it, depends on which one we have, we'll pay 1 and we'll negate our draw and instead return a permanent we control to our hand. So if we've got both Nature's Chosen and Instill Energy and one of our untapper creatures, so like a Sanctum Weaver or even just a Bird of Paradise or an Arbor Elf with an enchanted land, this will allow us to effectively bounce all of the permanents our opponents control to their hand. We can also draw out our entire deck if we have 2 Enchantress triggers. So on the first one, we'll pay 1 mana, and then to return another permanent so we can return our Instill Energy, and then we let the other Enchantress trigger resolve. So we'll continue to do this over and over and over again, and then we can either cast our Thassa's Oracle or the Jace and win the game from there. So kind of a commander agnostic combo that we can do to end the game. And then we've got our Parallax Wave and then the Opalescence. It's 1 mana cheaper than the Starfield. If you really want the redundancy, you could probably find a place for it. As far as Starfield of Nyx is concerned, I don't think we really need it here, so just the 2. It's cheaper, so if we're in a situation where we need to manually resolve the combo, we can do that, and it'll be just a little bit easier for us to do. Again, the 2 seals, we've also added seal removal. All 3 of these are just fantastic. Root Maze forces all of our opponent's artifacts and lands to come in tabbed. This hits a lot of things. Not only does it hit the artifacts like Blind Obedience does, but it also stops our opponent's lands. So fetch lands become really, really bad when this thing comes out, especially turn 1. We got Rhystic Study as a way to draw cards off our opponent's spells, and Stasis as just more redundancy on the Winter Orb, Statter Orb interaction there. And again, Estrid plays around these effects super, super well. So really, really great way for us to kind of lock down the board and create our overwhelming advantage there. Power Artifact is primarily for the Chain Veil. So one really awkward thing about the Chain Veil and Estrid is kind of what I was talking about before, is we don't want to be minusing Estrid. We primarily want to be plussing her up. So it gets kind of awkward if we don't have the Power Artifact out on our Chain Veil. So we'll essentially -1 on Estrid, which puts her at 2, and then to put the mask on the Chain Veil, then we'll tap our Chain Veil to allow us to activate Estrid again, and then we'll +2. And because she's at 2 now, she'll go up to 4 and then 6. And then if you put her to 8 and you minus her to ult, it gets kind of awkward just because she's now at 1 loyalty and you don't have a way to activate her again. But what you can do is if you have Estrid and Jace out, you can effectively draw through your entire deck. So with Jace, you can mill yourself and then draw a card, and then with his ability, you just win the game. So if you're in a situation where you need a minus and then plus, you can do that, or you could also just minus twice, but that takes 2 turns in a row, and that can get a little awkward. So just a little bit of awkwardness with the Chain Veil, but it still can work. And if we're in a situation where the Power Artifact is already on the Chain Veil, we can just go ahead and plus up Estrid, activate Chain Veil, plus up Estrid again, activate the Chain Veil, minus the Estrid, and then immediately ult, and then go from there. And if you aren't familiar with how the Chain Veil works, so you pay 4 and tap it. For each planeswalker you control, you may activate one of its loyalty abilities once this turn, as though none of its loyalty abilities have been activated this turn. And because of the way it's worded, this allows you to stack that ability. So every time you activate this ability, it adds on to itself. So let's say you've activated three times in one turn, and you recast your Estrid. You can now activate your Estrid 3 times. So essentially, you can get to a point where you can basically plus her up to 14 and then minus her twice. And once you get to that point, you basically don't have to worry about how much she costs anymore, because you're gonna just have enough mana to do the Chain Veil and recast your Estrid over and over and over again. Especially since we can find the auras to give us more mana. So yeah, really cool interaction going on there. Then we'll move on to our lands. All of our lands are entering untapped at this point. A few basic lands, just to help us out here. It can be a little awkward since, well, we're not on the Karn's Bastion anymore. We're just on the Forge of Heroes at this point. Kind of the same interaction that we said before. And if we're in a situation where we could minus Estrid to put the thing on Chain Veil, and then we can use the Forge of Heroes to put that counter back on her immediately and put her on the odd counters. But we want to kind of negate as many colorless sources as possible. And so we're just going to be on like Forge of Heroes right now. And yeah, we're not even on Hull of Helios Generosity anymore. Don't really need it. If you think you really do, you can, but more colorless lands can create awkward situations, especially in a pip-heavy deck like this. We have some colorless costs, but a lot of mana-intensive stuff. We want to make sure that we can cast our spells on time when we get them. Then again, we're going to look at our curve. So we're going to compare this to our other curves. You can see as we move up in power level, our curve is becoming more efficient. We're using less big spells, and we're using, if we do go above like 4 or 5, it's because we really need them as far as our combos, and they are more or less going to help us in the game, if not be our actual win cons. So if you see here, we got a few permanents at 4. Jace is actually one of our win cons. Eidolon is probably the weakest of our 4 drops here, but in my opinion gives us enough utility that it's worth running. Chain Veil, it's one of our win cons, and then the other 2 4-mana drops are the Opalescence and the Parallax Wave, again, one of our combos. So, as we move up in power levels, our overall mana value is going to go down, and with that respect, our lane count can go down as well, because our mana production becomes more efficient, like I was talking about with our mana dorks in the beginning. The more impact we can have on the early game, the better. So, and that's going to be the Estrid deck tech. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to going over the next deck tech with you guys.